Hello. I'm going to talk about your reading for this module from Arthur Danto, his book After the End of Art, which is actually a collection of essays. I had you all read, I believe, the first three chapters. Danto, this is a little bit of a jump for us in this class, chronologically, of course, because we're talking about Nietzsche in the previous module, and here with Danto we jump to, for all intents and purposes, a contemporary philosopher of art. He recently died. Arthur Danto did. He was professor of philosophy at Columbia University, and he was one of the most esteemed philosophers of art of the 20th century, although not without his critics. We're making this jump because I thought it was a fitting ending to the text we've been reading and, broadly speaking, the narrative that you have been following. Philosophy of art in the West, for 2,000 years since Plato, it was taken for granted that, that beauty was the main concern. And what is remarkable about the 20th century is that that is no longer the case. So, why is that? Why did that come about? And I like Danto because he helps us make sense of this. He also is a very, I think, compelling continuation of the propositions laid down by Hegel. He is a Hegelian. I'll point that out as we go ahead. I think that's one of the main reasons he ended up being rather he was kind of a lightning rod, quite frankly. I had a professor in grad school who absolutely detested him and reminded us of that all the time. But anyway, let us dive in. He tells us early on here, he sets the tone, if you will. Around page 10, he says that he talks a little bit about some of the art movements of the 20th century. He talks about surrealism. He tells us in page 9, actually says that surrealism is outside the pale of history, which is a curious way of putting it. And outside the pale of history essentially means that it is ahistorical. It doesn't fit with the plan or the path of history. Contemporary art, by contrast, which he distinguishes from surrealism, is not beyond the pale of history. But it is something else. It is something wholly new and unique that is a culmination of that history. Which is, a weird way of putting it. Is it a period in the history of art at all? No, it is not, because it is radical departure. It is after any such periods, according to him. Contemporary art is post-historical. It is not ahistorical, it is post-historical. Ahistorical, to say that surrealism is ahistorical means that it doesn't fit with the narrative at all. Post-historical means that contemporary art is a logical rejoinder, if you will. Culmination, conclusion, to which the narrative has been building up. It is post-historical, and it has no stylistic unity. He tells us on page 12, it is a period of perfect freedom and a period of aesthetic entropy. Entropy, the scientific term referring to the dispersion of everything. Maybe the word is the word dispersal? I need more coffee. Everything disperses in entropy. It falls apart, if you will. The cover of this book, After the End of Art, is indicative of who or what he thinks is very momentous in the history of art. This, in case you couldn't tell, is a piece by Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol is the great genius, according to Danto. Pop art, the movement of pop art, of which Warhol was a member, or his work was considered part of the pop art movement, along with, I believe it was Roy Lichtenstein. Those are the two names that stick in my mind. This is the very early 60s. These mark, pop art, Warhol, this marks the difference. This announces the difference of contemporary art. In particular, the piece, Warhol's piece, Brillo boxes. Now, I need to say a word about Brillo, because I'm not sure that contemporary audiences can appreciate this. Brillo, for those of you who don't know, and we do have some international students here, Brillo is an American brand of sponge. In particular, well, when I grew up, we had Brillo pads, and Brillo pads are steel wire, steel mesh that you would use to scrub, you would scrub dishes. It's not a soft sponge, it's a hard sponge meant to take off kind of the encrusted remains of food, et cetera, et cetera. And Brillo boxes, so Brillo was a very commonly known, a very pervasive, very popular, very mundane brand. So if we were to try and capture or appreciate what Warhol is up to, we might have to think in terms of similar brands today. I propose Dove, Irish Spring. What other laundry detergents are there? You get the picture, I hope. Here's a nice quote on page 13 at the bottom about the Brillo boxes. He says, to use my favorite example, this is about a third of the way from the bottom, nothing need mark the difference outwardly between Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes and the Brillo boxes in the supermarket. And conceptual art demonstrated that there need not even be a palpable visual object for something to be a work of visual art. That meant that you could no longer teach the meaning of art by example. It meant that, as far as appearances were concerned, anything could be a work of art. And it meant that if you were going to find out what art was, you had to turn from sense experience to thought. You had, in brief, to turn to philosophy. He goes on here. In an interview in 1969, conceptual artist Joseph Kossuth claimed that the only role for an artist at the time was to investigate the nature of art itself. This sounds strikingly like the line in Hegel that gave support to my own views about the end of art. Art invites us to intellectual consideration, and that not for the purpose of creating art again, but for knowing what art is. This Joseph Kossuth, I do not know him, but he's a conceptual artist, and conceptual art is a creature of contemporary art. The suggestion that art can be merely conceptual or largely conceptual. Contemporary artworks don't need to look any particular way. Indeed, I'm thinking of the Baltimore Museum of Art. Many of you are not in Baltimore, but there is in the past decade, they've added a wing for contemporary art. And if you ever have the chance to go there, you will notice that, in the more traditional, the Baltimore Museum of Art is a very esteemed special place. It houses, it's probably its most important collection is the Cone collection. The Cone sisters lived in Baltimore City in the early 1900s, and they were one of the first collectors of Impressionism. And in particular, the Baltimore Museum of Art has a large collection of Matisse, who I'm going to quote in a little bit. And when you visit the older traditional part of the museum, you are looking at canvases on the wall. And then suddenly you enter the contemporary art wing and anything is fair game. One piece that I like in particular by an artist whose name escapes me. He was a Latino artist from the late 20th century who died of AIDS, and his partner died of AIDS. And he made some very complex and stunning and confrontational pieces. I think this is what Danto is getting at. One of the pieces that this artist has in the BMA is it's like a door made of beads. I don't know how to put this otherwise. This used to be a big thing in the 1960s in America. You'd have beads in front of a door and you'd push through the beads on a string and walk in. Except that his is gigantic. It's probably about 20 feet across, 20 feet high, and the beads are gorgeous. And I do not recall the point of that piece, but he is famous for another piece, and I can't remember if this one is at the BMA, but he created a piece that involved individually wrapped pieces of candy that were piled in the corner of a gallery. And they, when weighed, they came to the exact weight of his partner who died of AIDS. And then the audience members were invited to take pieces of candy. So, you know, I'm not an art historian. I'm not going to dive into or explore what this artist was trying to do here. I'm just trying to point out the point. I'm just trying to point out Danto's argument, what he's trying to say here, which is that suddenly contemporary art is much more perplexing, it's confrontational, it poses questions, it engages. It sees the more traditional museum and artwork as you know, the audience enters into a passive relationship with, you know, these pieces, contemplating them. But contemporary art is much more active. You have to turn to philosophy to understand what is going on here. This is what he tells us in the top of page 14. Art invites us to intellectual consideration, not for the purpose of creating art, again, but for knowing philosophically what art is. Knowing philosophically what art is. Philosophy considers the intent of production when the objects themselves cannot announce it. And these works inherently raise the philosophical question of the nature of art itself. These pieces in contemporary art are philosophical questions. The question they ask over and over again is this art? Or what is art? And they unsettle the audience in this regard. This leads to his question, what of art after the end of art? Well, he says, an artwork now poses this essential question, why am I a work of art? And as I've been discussing, he says the emergence of contemporary art wrought havoc on the museum. And in the latter part of your first essay, he talks a lot about the MoMA, which is the Museum of Modern Art. Modern art, I should consult my art history friends, but that is a period that I believe is traditionally inaugurated with Manet, who, not Monet, but Manet, who was a French artist in the late 1800s. It involves a degree of realism, and is also politically and socially confrontational. Modernism, I think art historians would say, is the period that runs up to contemporary art. And the MoMA in the 1950s was a very cutting edge place. But then suddenly contemporary art comes around and the MoMA does not seem quite so modern in the colloquial sense of the word. It is rather antiquated and does not know how to handle these pieces. He tells us on 16 here, and that bottom paragraph at the top, he says, in any case, with the philosophical coming of age of art, visuality drops away as little relevant to the essence of art as beauty proved to have been. For art to exist, there does not even have to be an object to look at, and if there are objects in the gallery, they can look like anything at all. And at the bottom of the page, he says, whatever art is, it is no longer something primarily to be looked at, stared at perhaps, but not looked at. Stared at, I'm thinking of Damien Hirst, his contemporary British artist, Hirst, H-I-R-S-T. He has a piece that involves a shark, a mummified, well, I mean, it's a dead shark in formaldehyde trapped in glass. He also had a, one of his better known pieces is a skull encrusted in diamonds. Why are these art? Right? These are to be stared at. Moving on to the next essay, he tells us that, contemporary art with pop art was the end of 6 centuries of creativity in the West. 6 centuries. This leads him to raise a thinker by the name of Hans Belting, who conceived of an era before art. So now we have Danto proposes that there's an era before art and an era after art. Let's talk for a second about what the era before art is. Well, 6 centuries before 20th century, that would be the 1400s, moving from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance in the West. What does it mean to say that prior to the Renaissance, that was an era before art? I'm thinking of the medieval artists like Giotto and Fra Filippo Lippi. And why would they not be art? It seems the proposition is, or his thinking is, that that what they were creating at that point, they were objects of worship. The era of art is ushered in when these objects can be viewed and treated secularly. When art is not merely or exclusively at the service of religion. That's how I think he understands it. But again, think of the larger point. There's an era before art, there's an era after art. He discusses in this essay the art movements of the early 20th century, and he calls this the age of manifestos, which is a funny way of putting it. Here's how he describes it on page 28 at the bottom. Each of the movements was driven, this is about a third of the way from the bottom, each of the movements was driven by a perception of the philosophical truth of art, that art is essentially X, and that everything other than X is not, or is not essentially art. So each of the movements saw its art in terms of a narrative of recovery, disclosure, or revelation of a truth that had been lost or only dimly acknowledged. Each was buttressed by a philosophy of history that defined the meaning of art by an end state, which consisted in the true art. Which is a funny way of putting it. The early 20th century was populated by ages of manifestos, various ages which ended on to one another. And each successive one said, now we are the end of art. By the end of art, meaning also the goal of art, the end state. Everything in art has been leading up to this stage, and now this alone is art and nothing else. No sooner had these manifestos been laid out than a new art form movement comes to the fore and dismisses or dispenses with the others. And the early 20th century is a little bit turbulent in this manner, in that we do roll through these manifestos pretty quickly, these art movements. And his point is that these are evidence of Hegel's late stage in the history of art, where art becomes highly self-conscious and transitions into philosophy. You'll notice that it's saying, this is art, this is art, this is art, and nothing else. Consider where he sees us now. This is on page 35. There's a beautiful quote here by Rothko on page 29. Rothko was an abstract expressionist, which was the movement just before pop art, late 50s. And Rothko says that we are creating art that will last 1,000 years. And the point is, how naive, right? It wouldn't even last a decade until the next movement rolled in. But here's a quote on the bottom, page 35. Danto says, until the 20th century, it was tacitly believed that works of art were always identifiable as such. The philosophical problem now is to explain why they are works of art. With Warhol, it became clear there's no special way a work of art must be. It can look like a Brillo box, or it can look like a soup can. Don't forget his other great series early in his career for Warhol was the Campbell's soup cans. He did paintings of all the different cans of Campbell's soup, tomato, navy bean, and chicken noodle. And people on the Upper East Side of Manhattan coming into the gallery had to look at that and say, now what the hell is this, right? What the hell is this? Is this art? It's almost as if Warhol was making fun of them, and he largely was. Warhol was a very clever guy, very slippery guy, very enigmatic. If you are able to find, if you're interested, there are a couple interviews with Warhol that can be found on the internet. I'll try and share one on our module if I remember it. But he is. What's interesting is when he is asked about the purpose of his art pieces, and he is so cagey, and he really doesn't say much at all. He's very coy. Feeds right into Danto's thesis that this is, there is no set agenda. It is overtly confrontational. It is asking the question, what is art? Is this art? Troublingly, though, especially from an artist, he tells us in the next page, he says, once the question, this is about a third of the way from the top, once the question is brought to consciousness at a certain moment in the historical unfolding of art, a new level of philosophical consciousness has been reached, and it means two things. It means first that having brought itself to this level of consciousness, art no longer bears a responsibility for its own philosophical definition. That rather is a task of philosophers of art. Second, it means that there is no way works of art need to look, since the philosophical definition of art must be compatible with every kind and order of art. The artists themselves are not necessarily responsible for answering their own question. They just pose the question. It's up to philosophers to struggle for that definition. That's either liberating for artists or kind of paternalistic. My art students tend to fall on both sides here. And in the next essay, he offers a very nice quote from Matisse on 44, where Matisse says, we are not the masters of what we produce. It is imposed on us, right? Artists are captive? No, I don't know. I don't like that term so much, but artists respond. Artists respond to what the Germans call Zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. They are somewhat a vessel, if you will. They don't necessarily need to be the agents or self-conscious authors of what they are doing. And this tying in with what we've been discussing earlier. So there are three periods of art according to Danto, and this echoes what is going on with Hegel. Don't forget, for Hegel, there were three periods of art: classical, romantic, and symbolic before that. Symbolic, classical, romantic. For Danto, the three principal eras of art are the era of imitation, the era of ideology, this is on page 47, and the post-historical era. The era of imitation, that is the era up until the 1800s, where the goal was to try and portray reality effectively, convincingly. I think that'll do. And then there is the era of ideology, which is the age of manifestos, and then the post-historical era. So there you have his adaptation of Hegel's view that we are now in a post-historical era where art is no longer defined by beauty. It's not even defined by visuality. It is principally philosophical. It is troubling. It is confrontational. It is amorphous and is totally free. Okay, thank you very much. Let me know if you have any questions. You may contact me. Thank you. Bye.